Hey guys, what is up? Welcome back, or if you're new here, just welcome in general. My name is Jessica, and here on my channel, I discuss new true crime cases each week. So if you have an interest in true crime or just the macabre in general, and you'd like to join me back here each week, go ahead and subscribe to my channel down below. Okay, so as you've likely deduced from my ghastly appearance, I will once again be getting ready while I go over today's case. I did this last week and I got a lot of positive feedback, so here we are, doing it again, and I have to say I'm pretty excited about it. I have a lot of fun doing my videos this way, and it's also more conducive time-wise for me, because instead of having to rush around and get ready to film, I can just sit down looking like an absolute toad, multitask, and kill two birds with one stone. So if I'm going to make this a regular feature on my channel, I obviously have to extend a thank you to Miss Sarian for popularizing this sort of like gruesome get ready with me style video and making it such a beloved content form, because it's really working out for me during my current season of life. Also, if no one staked their claim on gruesome get ready with me, I'm gonna go ahead and call dibs because I kind of like it. Anyways, what do you say that we wrap this intro up and get straight into today's story? Okay, so today we're going to be talking about the half-solved-ish disappearance of a little girl, and it's incredibly sad and it's incredibly frustrating. So I just want to go ahead and let you know that straight out of the gate. Melissa Lee Brannen was born on April 12th, 1984 in Texas to her parents, Michael and Tammy Brannen. However, when Melissa was just a toddler, Michael and Tammy decided to get divorced. And even though the split was fairly amicable and they remained friendly afterwards, it was still a divorce, you know? It was still a big, distressing, life-altering event that was mentally and emotionally taxing. So when all was said and done, Tammy still wanted a clean break. She still felt as though she needed a fresh start. And in 1986, she went for it. She packed up everything she owned and she moved over 1,500 miles northeast with Melissa into a 2-bedroom apartment in Lorton, Virginia. She'd taken a job working as an accountant at a defense contracting company, and she was really just ready to hit the ground running in her new city. And as soon as Melissa and her mom settled into their new home in the Woodside apartment complex, they fell immediately in love with it. It seemed really safe. Everyone was really welcoming and friendly. There were a ton of other children in the complex for Melissa to make friends with, and to help facilitate not only Melissa's blossoming friendships, but to also help Tammy get out and make new friends, there was a pretty substantial social calendar for the residents. There were weekly, mixer style events, and there were special events around the holidays. All in all, it just seemed like a really incredible place to raise a child. It was such a family-focused community. Unfortunately, though, it would be one of those exact beloved social events that would change the Brannens' lives forever. On December 3rd, 1989, roughly 200 residents of the Woodside Apartments, including Tammy and 5-year-old Melissa, gathered in the complex's clubhouse for a Christmas party. The adults were socializing, the children were running around playing games, the halls were decked, bells were jingling, and everyone was just having a holly jolly time. It wasn't until around 10 p.m. that Tammy tracked Melissa down and let her know that, it was getting late and it was about time that they wrap up and head home. So together they began kind of making the rounds so Tammy could say goodbye to a few people. And as they did this, she happened to get pulled into a conversation with one of her friends. And while she was talking, Melissa asked if she could run and grab just one last plate of chips from the snack bar in the other room before they left. Tammy agreed, likely assuming that by the time Melissa returned, she'd be done with her conversation and she and her daughter could head out and they'd be home and in bed probably by 11. However, devastatingly, after that very moment, Tammy would never see Melissa again. When Melissa didn't return just a few minutes after walking away to grab a snack, Tammy started asking around if anyone had seen her. I doubt she freaked out immediately. My guess is that at first she probably just figured that on the way to get her chips, Melissa had gotten sidetracked, either talking to one of her friends or playing with some other kids. But once Tammy had kind of made the rounds, asking people if they'd seen Melissa, and she was even walking around calling out her name throughout different rooms of the clubhouse, but she still couldn't find her daughter, and that is when she started freaking out. And rightfully so. I mean, it's every parent's absolute worst nightmare. Clearly seeing that something was wrong, the other party guests joined in and trying to help Tammy find her daughter, but it was becoming increasingly obvious with every second that ticked by that Melissa was gone. Therefore, Fairfax Police Department was called within minutes of Tammy realizing that Melissa was gone. And they arrived almost just as quickly. They first spoke to Tammy in an effort to find out exactly what had happened before they then went on to perform their own search of the building and the surrounding area. And this search effort was not just from police. There were over 100 people searching for Melissa, including other residents of the apartment complex, as well as military personnel. Everyone was desperately hoping that this was just a misunderstanding and that Melissa had wandered off and, I don't know, maybe gotten lost somewhere, and that eventually she'd be found. Regardless of where exactly she'd went, they knew that time was of the essence, because even if she had just simply gotten lost, it was painfully cold outside that night, and if not found quickly, it was feared that Melissa wouldn't survive out in the elements overnight. However, and not for lack of trying, this extensive grid search also came up empty-handed, basically forcing everyone to accept the grim reality that Melissa had likely not wandered off voluntarily. So the next step was for police to question not just the residents who'd attended the party, but they also interviewed over 400 additional Woodside residents. But no one could recall having seen anything suspicious or out of the ordinary. Tammy was thoroughly interviewed in her apartment before being asked to think long and hard if she knew anyone who might have a motive to want to harm either her or her daughter. But she could not think of anyone. She was friendly with her ex-husband. She didn't have any issues at work. She got along well with all of her neighbors. I mean, try as she might, she had absolutely no clue who could possibly be responsible for having taken her daughter. And while this questioning was going on, some of the other officers were performing yet another search of the clubhouse, this time more so looking for evidence of an abduction rather than just looking for Melissa herself. And this is when they stumbled across an open window in a utility room, which was secluded down a hallway back near the restrooms. And because no one had seen Melissa leave the party or be taken out through the front door, it quickly became believed that she had been taken out of the building through this exact window. So the case of Melissa Brannen had now officially moved from just a missing child case to a definite case of child abduction, making this significantly more urgent. Police returned to Tammy's apartment to collect some of Melissa's belongings for possible DNA comparison, and they also started to ramp up the intensity of their interviews. And thankfully, this increased pressure seemed to have the residents thinking even harder about some of the things that they'd seen that evening. And slowly but surely, police began to notice that one man's name was being repeated over and over and over again to them. Because apparently Mr. Caleb Hughes was not just the building's maintenance man, but as it would turn out, he was also a certified creep who'd spent most of his time at the Christmas party making unsolicited, vulgar comments and lewd offers to the women. And when he wasn't doing that, he was letting all of the parents know that whenever the time came, he was ready and available to take their children to the bathroom if needed. I'm sorry. What? Bro, I'd rather stick my hand in a fucking blender than let you anywhere near a child, let alone request that you accompany mine to the bathroom. You mean to tell me that you just spent all night giving every grown woman on the premises the ick, and now you think that you get to be the self-proclaimed bathroom chaperone to all the children? What is wrong with you? Stop it. Now, obviously, after hearing all of this, Caleb very quickly found his way onto the police's list of persons of interest. And when I say list of persons of interest, I mean probably just like a post-it note with Caleb's name scribbled on it. So with this being their only lead, police tried desperately to reach out to Caleb via phone, but despite calling him repeatedly, they weren't able to reach him. So they decided to just go ahead and make the 4-mile drive to his home to speak to him in person. However, when they arrived, he was nowhere to be found, and his wife told police that she also had absolutely no idea where he was. So they were able to conclude that he had definitely left the party before they'd even showed up to Woodside, but somehow they managed to beat him to his house. Even after they'd spent so much time searching the apartment complex and questioning residents, they still got there first. Yikes. And it actually wouldn't be until almost 3 hours after Melissa's disappearance that Caleb would finally decide that, maybe he ought to return the phone calls from police regarding the child that went missing from the party he was just creeping around at all night. So around 1 a.m., police made their way back to the home that Caleb shared with his wife in order to question him, but surprise, surprise, he denied having anything to do with Melissa's abduction. He also happened to be one of those people who just seemed to have an answer for everything. He explained to police that, yes, he'd left the party before 10. He'd decided to go and get some beer and then just take a nice scenic drive around the area rather than come straight home. And while obviously this is hardly an alibi, it wasn't something that police were able to discredit right then and there. So they decided to try a different line of questioning. You see, when they'd been interviewing the residents of the Woodside apartment complex, a few of them had mentioned that Caleb had looked out of place at the party because while most everyone was at least fairly dressed up, he'd shown up in the exact same, grubby work clothes that he always wore around. However, standing there in front of them now, Caleb appeared to be wearing something completely different. So they asked him about it. Why had he felt the need to come home and immediately change his clothes before police arrived to speak with him? But like I said, Caleb had an answer for everything, and this line of questioning was no exception. He explained to police that he only had one set of those work clothes and that he always washed them right when he got home. So there you have it. Despite how it looked, it totally wasn't weird at all that it had taken him hours to make it home from a party that took place 4 miles away from his house. And it certainly wasn't out of the question that when he did finally arrive home in the middle of the night, that he would feel compelled to strip down and wash every single thing that he'd been wearing that evening, including his shoes, belt, and knife sheath. Shocking as it may be to hear, police weren't so sure that he was telling them the truth, so they escorted him down to the station for further questioning. But unfortunately for police, he was smug and evasive while they interrogated him, and he even had the insolence to tell police that if they really thought that he'd taken Melissa, then they were just gonna have to go right on ahead and prove it, which, correct me if I'm wrong, but I'd assume that when you're being interrogated by police, it's probably not within your best interest to literally throw down the fucking gauntlet in front of them, but what do I know? And what's even more frustrating than Caleb's sheer audacity is the fact that due to a lack of any real evidence against him, they had to let him go once they'd finished questioning him. And yes, I understand that you can't just imprison someone for being a douche, even when it's painfully obvious that they're guilty of something so terrible. I get it. But also, it's stupid and I hate it. I guess the silver lining of it all is that, one, at least now they had a direction to focus their investigation in, and two, they were pretty confident that they weren't wasting their time looking into the wrong person. So, as more and more volunteers congregated every hour to expand the search for Melissa, distributing over 35,000 flyers and 10,000 bumper stickers, police went full steam ahead with their investigation into Caleb. They'd collected his clothing from the night of the party, as well as, with her permission, police also impounded Caleb's wife's red Honda Civic, which happened to be the vehicle that he'd been driving that night. And once they had it in their possession, it was thoroughly swept for forensic evidence. Disappointingly, they didn't immediately find any obvious evidence like blood or fingerprints or anything like that, but they did find a ton of different fibers to send off for analysis, which they hoped that they might be able to somehow match to Melissa's clothing because the coloring looked so similar. But that said, without actually possessing the clothes that she was wearing the night she disappeared, it would be pretty difficult, if not impossible, for them to say definitively one way or another. They then went through the vehicle with luminol, which did ultimately confirm the previous presence of blood throughout the car. They also found what appeared to be bloodstains on Caleb's shoes, despite the fact that not only had he tried to wash it away, but he'd also tried to cut it away. Like, this man had straight up hacked portions of the rubber sole of his shoe off to try and hide the fact that there had once been blood on them. Thankfully, all this managed to do was make detectives even more suspicious of him, if that was even possible. So, now having at least some evidence to use to try and back him into a corner, police brought Caleb back in for a polygraph test, which he failed, but unfortunately beyond that, they still weren't able to garner any additional information from him, and again, they had to let him walk. Meanwhile, poor Tammy Brannen was sitting at home, desperately hoping that her daughter would return someday. She was so hopeful that she even left Melissa's Christmas presents under the tree for her to open when she did return. And I'm here to tell you that that fact turned my heart into a pile of dust. I mean, that is so freaking sad. Thankfully, Tammy lived in an incredibly supportive community. Obviously, I've already touched on how active they were in the search for Melissa, but in addition to that, the local movie theaters showed home movies of Melissa to try and keep her face fresh in everyone's minds. And just like in the Vicki Lynn Hoskinson case, people tied yellow ribbons around their Christmas trees and their porches and their balconies to signify their hope for Melissa's safe return. A monetary award was also offered for any help that led to Melissa's safe return, and Tammy was even visited and consoled by a woman named Leanne Gordon, who'd lost her own 10-year-old daughter Rosie 5 months earlier under very similar circumstances. Like I said, the community was super family-oriented, so they really tried to do anything and everything they possibly could to lift up and support Tammy. Eventually, Melissa's disappearance even garnered the attention of the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children, who sent one of their own experts to Lorton to help aid in the search for Melissa. Now, obviously, police were looking to obtain as much information as humanly possible on their suspect, which ultimately led them to return to the Hughes residence to formally interview Caleb's wife, Carol. And fun fact, Miss Carol, she didn't trust her man. So much so that she frequently kept tabs on their car's gas mileage. I mean, I don't know what she thought she was going to catch him doing. Maybe she thought he was out gallivanting around town, being a little slut. But regardless of her reasoning, Carol had actually taken note of her Honda's mileage just before Caleb had left for the party. Therefore, police were able to conclude that 12 miles had been put on the car the evening that Melissa went missing, which vastly narrowed down the area that was necessary to search. So knowing this, they took a map, and using 2 thumbtacks, they marked the apartment complex and Caleb's house. And then they took a string that was equal to 12 linear miles on their map, tied it into a circle, and used it as almost like a stencil to define the perimeter of where they should continue searching. Then on December 8th, 1989, investigators organized a search of that specific 25 square mile area, and over 500 people turned out to help in these search efforts. There were community volunteers and police officers, military personnel, and once they broke down into individual smaller search teams, they made sure that each team had at least some civilians, some military members, and some police officers. They were all given very specific instructions on how to search and what to look for and how to appropriately mark anything that they believed to be potential evidence without compromising it. This search was very well organized and very methodical. I definitely want to give credit where credit is due. There was so much thought and effort put into each and every search for Melissa. But unfortunately, this search, just like every search before it, yielded virtually no evidence. It seemed as though the only evidence they were ever going to have in this case was the forensic evidence that had been collected from Caleb's car, which was still being analyzed by the FBI. They were desperately trying to find some way to connect Melissa to that vehicle with the fibers and the blood they'd collected. Because if they couldn't, they didn't know if they'd ever find another way to definitively connect Caleb to the crime and put him behind bars where he belonged. Unfortunately, they were not off to a great start. The blood they'd collected from his car had been ruined by the luminol. The blood on his shoes had been too compromised from the washing machine to be of any use to them. And without the clothing that Melissa had been wearing the night of her disappearance, they were also kind of at a standstill as far as the fibers were concerned. It was beginning to look like Caleb Hughes was going to remain a free man, a thought that was absolutely revolting to almost everyone in town. Tensions were high and all eyes were on Caleb. Melissa's story, as well as the suspicion surrounding Caleb, was frequently covered on the news. That is, until January 1990, when a judge revoked Caleb's current probation due to a violation for drunk driving, finally giving police a tangible, solid, concrete reason to lock his ass up. And this bought them months to work on their investigation without having to worry that Caleb might hurt someone else. With Caleb behind bars and the pressure on investigators slightly reduced, they now had time to dive into the complex forensic testing that needed to be completed on the fibers they'd collected from Caleb's car. The FBI analysts had 50 blue acrylic fibers, some red cotton fibers, and 2 animal hairs that had been collected from the passenger seat, as well as a human hair that had been pulled from the driver's seat. Now, the human hairs, although similar to the hairs that had been taken from Melissa's hairbrush, could not definitively be determined to be a match to hers. And beyond that, as I've said, 100 times, without Melissa's clothing from the evening, it was impossible for them to determine whether or not the fibers they believed to be from her navy blue and red plaid Big Bird outfit were actually from Melissa's specific shirt and skirt. However, not all was lost, because forensic analysts were able to match fibers from Tammy's fur coat to the animal hairs that had been collected from Caleb's vehicle. Rabbit hairs, to be specific. Rabbit hairs that matched the fur that made up Tammy Brannen's very unique fur coat that she'd purchased years ago in Germany. So it's not like she ran to Walmart and picked up the same coat that 30 other women in town also had. This coat was specifically unique to Tammy. So in other words, it was way more likely than not that these specific fibers had been transferred from Tammy's coat onto Melissa, and then from Melissa onto Caleb's passenger seat. But even though this was an exciting development, it was something they could foresee being easily explained away. After all, Caleb and Tammy had both been at the same party that evening, so it wasn't completely out of the question that at one point in the evening, they'd brushed up against one another and the fibers had been transferred that way. I mean, we know that's not what happened, but they had to prove it beyond a reasonable doubt. They would only have one chance, and they could not mess it up. They had to find a way to prove indubitably that Melissa had been in that car, which, once again, brought them back to the fibers believed to be from Melissa's clothing. If they could figure out a way to prove that those fibers were from the set that she'd been wearing the night of the Christmas party, then surely there would be no room left for anyone to believe that Caleb was innocent. Not that I think a lot of people were under that impression anyway, but, law and stuff. So they spoke with Tammy to try and find out exactly where she'd purchased the outfit from Melissa from, in hopes of tracking down a duplicate to try and run their comparison tests on. But as luck would have it, the outfit had actually been purchased for Melissa by her grandmother. And when Grandma got questioned, no matter how hard she tried, she just could not remember where she'd purchased it from, bringing them to what felt like yet another dead end. Fearing that his investigation might be circling the drain, Agent Doug Dietrich began venting to his wife one evening about how frustrated he was that he couldn't place where the outfit had come from, and how, if he could, he was confident that he could solve this case. He just couldn't believe that it was this hard to track down the manufacturer of this Big Bird skirt set. Upon hearing this, Agent Dietrich's wife stops dead in her tracks, looks at her husband and says, "Big Bird, you say?" And he's like, "Yeah, Big Bird from Sesame Street. Navy blue sweatshirt, red plaid sleeves and skirt with a big old Big Bird patch in the bottom corner." And then, like a magician, or a hoarder, I guess, however you want to look at it, Dietrich's wife disappears into the bedroom, only to emerge a few moments later with a JCPenney catalog from the year before, featuring a listing for none other than the outfit Melissa Brannen was wearing the night she disappeared. Isn't that outrageous? What are the chances that the wife of one of the main agents on this case would have the answer to the question plaguing this case sitting in a stack of old magazines tucked away in a corner of their home? That is just crazy. So now, with hope restored, Agent Dietrich contacted JCPenney, explained the situation, and asked them if there was any way he could get one of the Big Bird outfits sent to him for forensic comparison. And JCPenney immediately deflated the balloon of hope his wife had so recently filled up for him. Because, as luck would have it, they only produced like a few thousand units of that particular outfit, all of which had sold out within a few months. So they didn't even have so much as a scrap of fabric to offer instead. The best they could do was to provide the FBI with the purchase history of the outfit. So a list of like 7,000 transactions that they would have to sift through to try and track down a remaining set. But considering it was quite literally the very last straw that they could grasp at, they took the list and got to work, one by one, contacting the people who'd purchased the outfit, hoping desperately that someone, somewhere, still had one lying around. Meanwhile, poor Tammy Brannen, it's been 2 months since Melissa was taken, and she's received little to no information regarding what might have happened to her daughter. I mean, she tried really hard to remain optimistic that Melissa would be found alive, but realistically, with each day that passed, the odds were mounting against that. And understandably, Tammy became increasingly depressed over the weeks that followed Melissa's abduction, eventually completely isolating herself within her apartment, just desperately waiting for something. Anything. Any tiny shred of information that might bring her closer to finding her daughter. And then, one day, out of the blue, she thought she might get just that. It was mid-February 1990 when Tammy received a phone call informing her that if she could deliver $75,000 to a Howard University dormitory address, then Melissa would be returned to her alive. But given the length of time that Melissa had been missing, detectives were very skeptical of the legitimacy of this caller. However, they told Tammy to go ahead and agree and comply with the ransom, and that they would take it from there. And on February 15th, an FBI agent posing as Tammy turned over the ransom to a courier, who then delivered the package to 20-year-old Emmett Muriel Grier III, who was immediately arrested, as well as his 24-year-old friend, Anthony McRae. It was quickly determined that Emmett and Anthony had absolutely nothing to do with Melissa's disappearance, and that this phone call and the ransom demand had just been their disgusting attempt to try and extort money out of a desperate, grieving mother. What the fuck is wrong with people? As if this woman isn't going through enough, these two absolute goons then gotta pile on for their own selfish gain? Trash. Eventually, the two of them were charged and convicted of conspiracy and extortion and, being huge douche lords. I mean, that last charge was just in the court of my own personal opinion, because fuck those guys. But the conspiracy and extortion charges, those were real, and I think they got just under 8 years in prison for them. So I guess that's that on that. So back to the crime lab. Investigators are working their way through their 7,000-point list, trying to track down a duplicate of Melissa's Big Bird outfit, when finally they contacted a man from Kentucky who'd purchased the outfit, and it turned out that he'd purchased it for his granddaughter, but he'd accidentally bought the wrong size. So not only did he have the outfit, but it had never been worn. So it was in absolutely pristine condition. So they arranged for him to send it to the lab, they receive it, and finally they were able to run the comparison test to determine if the blue fibers from Caleb's vehicle could place Melissa in his car. And lo and behold, the blue fibers from the car turned out to be an exact match to the blue fibers from the Big Bird outfit. So statistically speaking, there was less than 1/3% chance that those fibers were left there by anyone other than Melissa. If you're wondering why the probability is so low when navy blue is such a common color, well, allow me to explain. When manufacturing that particular outfit, JCPenney actually created a new dye color, which they called Plum Navy 887, and they patented and trademarked it. So it was impossible for anyone else anywhere to have used that exact same color to create any other garment. However, if you're still skeptical, how different could this navy blue actually be from any other navy blue? Well, don't worry, because I have an answer for that too. One of those people who just seem to have an answer for everything. Agent Dietrich ran almost 8,000 other comparison tests on different navy blue fibers that he collected from random other pieces of clothing, just to be 1,000% sure that there was no other explanation for the origin of these fibers in Caleb's car other than Melissa having been in there. And after tirelessly double and triple checking his work, Dietrich confirmed without question that those fibers were absolutely 100% unique to Melissa's Big Bird outfit. They finally had him. It was theorized that Caleb, following the rejection of damn near every woman at the Christmas party, had decided to give up on taking home a woman his own age and instead decided to abduct one of the many children there that he viewed to be available to him. That he waited and watched, just hoping for an opportunity to get one of the children alone. And unfortunately, as the party began to wind down, he found one. It's assumed that he grabbed Melissa and led her from the clubhouse ballroom down the hallway to the maintenance room, out the window, through the nearby woods to a parking lot where he ultimately forced her into his car. And now, with evidence to back that theory up, almost a year after Melissa's disappearance, Caleb Hughes was finally charged in relation to her abduction. However, despite the belief that Melissa was gone, at the time, Virginia required a proven location of a body in order to charge someone with murder. So the most the prosecutors could go after Caleb for was the abduction of a minor with immoral purpose, which, not surprisingly, he pled not guilty to. So his case went to trial on February 26th, 1991, where a jury heard 8 days of testimony prior to being excused for deliberation and returning just 9 hours later with a big, fat, sloppy, wet guilty verdict for Caleb Hughes. He was sentenced to 50 years in prison for his crime, but even so, he has always maintained his innocence. He's never taken any responsibility or shown any remorse for what he did, and what's worse is he's never revealed the location of Melissa's remains. Not even when Tammy herself sat down with him and begged him for answers. Still just nothing. And even though it's believed that once he'd taken Melissa from the party, he'd taken her somewhere secluded, raped her, and murdered her before returning home to attempt to wash away the evidence. Because her body has never been found, poor Tammy Brannen has been left to wonder for over 30 years what exactly happened to her daughter, which is a pain that I cannot even begin to imagine. I mean, the pain of losing a child would be one thing, but to never have the closure of at least knowing what happened to them or where their remains are, it's honestly nauseating to think about. Tammy even stated after Caleb was found guilty that, quote, "This isn't really a victory because I still don't have my daughter back. We still don't know where Melissa is, and until I know what happened to my child, it isn't over for me. And our family is going to do everything in our power to make sure that he never makes parole," unquote. But sadly, and I'm sure it was not for lack of trying, the Brannens were eventually forced to watch Caleb Hughes be released back into society. In 2019, after serving 29 years of his sentence, he was released over 20 years early due to good behavior. He's been out for 3 years, and aside from having to register as a sex offender, he's been out just living as a free man, doing whatever he wants, walking among us. He's worked a few different jobs since his release, at a restaurant, a cosmetics manufacturer, a staffing company. So if you currently live in Virginia, I don't know, maybe consider moving. Otherwise, he's your problem now. As for Tammy, about 8 years after this all went down, she did move and get remarried, but she has always kept the same phone number and always kept her last name listed as Brannen, because deep down, she still maintains hope that somehow, someday, Melissa might return home. And to this day, Melissa's disappearance is still technically considered an unsolved homicide, but it is far from forgotten. The Fairfax cold case detectives remain hell-bent on bringing Melissa home. In 2019, as the 30-year anniversary of Melissa's disappearance approached, Tammy made a statement regarding what she's been through and still continues to go through, as well as applauding the Fairfax Police Department for their continued dedication to Melissa, stating, quote, "The Fairfax Police never cease to amaze me with their dedication to this case. What they're doing and what they've done all along, they've never stopped. It becomes a part of the fabric of your life. I miss my daughter every day. It's been 30 years, but that doesn't stop me from missing her. There's the not knowing what happened. There's the not knowing if she suffered, the not knowing where she is, what she could have become, what grandkids would I have now. All of these things I wonder about at least periodically," unquote. Melissa would be 38 years old today, and although it's a long shot, if by chance you have some information regarding her disappearance, I will have the Fairfax Police Department's phone number listed down below. But unfortunately, beyond that, we're about wrapped for today. Let me know your thoughts on this case in the comments down below. As always, I thank you so much for taking the time to watch this video and to listen to this story. If you haven't already and you'd like to, go ahead and subscribe to my channel and turn on your post notifications. That way you're notified every time I upload a new video. I put out a new video each week, and I'd love to catch you back here in my next one. But until then, stay safe and have a good week. Bye, guys.